Hi, everybody. My name is Robert Musiala. I'm the co-leader of the blockchain legal practice at Baker Hostetler, a national law firm. Thank you for tuning in to listen to me today, talk about blockchain for enterprise, legal and business issues. Thanks so much to all the folks at Truffle. I had a fantastic time at the conference last year. Too bad we can't do it in person this year, but I really tip my hat to the Truffle team for turning this into a great virtual conference. As one housekeeping note that I'll mention before I get started, this slide deck will be available to those of you who are tuning in today and who would like a copy. I ask that if you find that you would like a copy of the slide deck, please put your email address into the chat feature. Scott will keep track of those email addresses, and I'll follow up later today or tomorrow or Monday and send a copy of this out to those who request it. And at the end of the slide deck, you'll find my contact information. If you later find that you want a copy, you should feel free to reach out to me directly. You can also find me pretty easily through a Google search online on the Baker Hostetler website. So that's enough about me. Let's get into the presentation. So here's a little bit of the agenda for today. So today's presentation is really intended to provide a framework for the three main business functions that will be involved in standing up a blockchain enterprise solution. And those are the business folks, the executives, the tech folks, the developers, and the legal folks, general counsels or other outside counsel. And what I found, having worked in this industry now for about 8 years, both on the consulting side and now for the past 3 years on the legal side, is that with blockchain enterprise solutions, there is a lot of potential and no shortage of creativity on the part of those developing them and who want to implement them. But they have proven to be very difficult to actually stand up in practice. And one of the main reasons for that, I think, is that by their very nature, these solutions require a lot of different independent businesses and organizations to come together around an enterprise solution. And then also it requires really those three business functions that I just mentioned, the business folks, the tech folks, and the legal folks, to really come together and start collaborating in ways that they're not necessarily used to. And so the presentation that I want to give today is intended to help folks see how they can start collaborating early and often in a way that will help them to bring their ideas to life in the blockchain enterprise context. So here on the slide, we see a little bit of an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. I'll briefly talk about why we should care about blockchain. I don't think I need to talk too much about that to the crowd today. I think we all are here because it's something that inspires us. I'll then talk about what I think is a question that doesn't get addressed often enough, which is the critical question of asking yourself whether blockchain makes sense before you go about moving forward with a potential enterprise solution. I'll then get into quite a bit of detail on what I call a current state, future state analysis, which I think is an important next step in trying to stand up a blockchain solution. So that's understanding the current state of the problem that you're trying to solve and the landscape that you're trying to work in, and then building out a vision of that future state where blockchain is now a part of that solution. I'll then get into a little bit of the new types of contractual relationships that will arise in blockchain enterprise consortia applications. I'll get into some of the details about your chosen blockchain protocol, what to think about when you're selecting a protocol. I'll then start to kind of zoom out and sort of talk about more high-level details. And I'll start by going over the 12 steps that I have outlined for what I call a roadmap for blockchain enterprise development that hopefully will provide a good framework for folks thinking about these issues. And then I'll close by talking about some of the really key legal issues to highlight and to leave folks with at the end of the presentation. I have until 25 past the hour. I'm going to try to finish up the presentation part with about 5 to 10 minutes to spare in case we have any questions. If we do, I'm happy to answer them to the best that I can with Scott helping to coordinate some of that. So with that, let's get right into it. So why care about blockchain? I usually, on this slide, I usually direct this to business folks who maybe haven't heard of blockchain or maybe have heard a little bit about it and are trying to understand why they should care about it. I think today, I want to take this opportunity to use some of the data points on this slide, in particular the bullet points with the stats from the Deloitte survey, as some useful information that I think you as a developer, you as a business executive might be able to use, and certainly I use these, as you're trying to make the case and build the case for why blockchain is something that your particular business needs to be thinking about. On the left-hand side there, those are the different industries that are experimenting with blockchain according to a report from McKinsey Consulting from about 2 years ago. And I think, the message there is that this technology is affecting all different sectors. And so no matter what kind of, business you're in or sector you're working in, I think there's a pretty strong case to say that it makes sense to evaluate where blockchain fits into your business model. And then on the right-hand side, I love these statistics from the Deloitte Global Executive Survey on blockchain. Deloitte's now published this survey for 3 years in a row. I always watch out for it and try to pull out some of these great stats. So what Deloitte does with this survey is they survey their global audit clients, and they're one of the largest professional service firms in the world. They have clients in all sorts of industries, and they survey executives. And so here on these 5 bullets are some of the 5 key takeaways from the most recent survey. So 88% of executives surveyed believe blockchain would achieve mainstream adoption. 86% saw a compelling business case for blockchain. 85% said they had suppliers, customers, or competitors who were discussing or working on blockchain solutions. 88% believe blockchain will enable new business processes and revenue streams. And finally, 83% perceive a competitive disadvantage if they do not adopt blockchain. And that's what I like to call blockchain FOMO. So I encourage you folks to use these stats, go back to the Deloitte survey, and use those as sort of data points that can help you as you seek to get buy-in from your management, get funding for R&D projects, or even investments from venture capitalists to the extent those of you are working for startups for blockchain solutions in the enterprise sector. Now I want to talk about what I think is another just really important aspect of all this stuff that I think does not get enough attention, which is the all-important question of analyzing whether blockchain makes sense for any particular use case that you're thinking about implementing it for. This is, I think, it's just critical. It's a critical first step because a lot of situations where people are talking about blockchain can actually, in many respects, be the problems they're looking to solve can be solved more easily and maybe even better with just a traditional centralized database. So it's important to have a really good understanding and be able to articulate for yourself why blockchain makes sense for the use case that you're thinking about implementing it for. Here on the slide, this is the framework that I have come up with. I've studied a lot of different frameworks, and I'll show some of those on the next 2 slides. But this is the sort of my own personal framework that I've come up with for evaluating whether blockchain makes sense. And it's asking yourself, and first of all, it's starting with the fundamental proposition that blockchain really only makes sense when you're in a situation where you have multiple business entities that are all looking to utilize the same data set. And if you have multiple business entities, then you want to ask yourself these 5 questions. Are all these entities, number 1, looking to rely and update the same data set? Number 2, mutually benefit. Would they mutually benefit from increased speeds, the increased speed of updates to that data set? Number 3, do they each want to independently verify updates to that data set as opposed to having a third party or trusting a third party to make those updates for them? Number 4, would everybody save money by cutting out a data intermediary in that data set? And then number 5, would they all share an interest in being able to automate certain transactions on that data set using things like smart contracts? And so what I like to say is if you can say yes to all 5 of these questions, or at least 4 of them, then blockchain is potentially a good solution for the problem that you're looking at. If you can only say yes to 3 or only 2 or only 1 or none of these questions, then blockchain is probably not a good solution. It probably doesn't make sense for that particular situation. On this slide, I want to show, there are a lot of different tests out there for trying to determine whether blockchain makes sense. I'm not going to walk through all of these, but I want to make sure that you all are aware of them. And as I said, if you request a copy of the slide deck, I'll provide these to you, and I encourage you to dig into these a little bit and apply them. I would suggest, apply the one that I just talked through and apply all 4 of these. And, to the degree that all of these different tests come out in the affirmative, then you've got, a higher degree of confidence that blockchain makes sense for the particular problem that you're trying to solve. And, so we've got tests here from PwC, from EY, from Microsoft, and from Consensus. And then one more that I want to point out, this is a little bit more complex and nuanced test from Accenture, where they ask you to consider the 5 questions on the left, and if you can say yes to all 3 of those, then they give you 10 additional considerations. And so these are all helpful frameworks that I encourage you all to be aware of and to use as you look to evaluate whether blockchain makes sense for a particular problem. And if the answer is yes, you can use these frameworks to help you build the business case to gain buy-in from business folks, R&D, folks that control the R&D funds, and even venture capitalists that may be looking to invest in a particular project. If you find that blockchain makes sense, one of the first things that I would recommend evaluating next is how easy or difficult it will be to standardize or normalize the data that you are looking to move onto and manage on a blockchain solution. This is, again, a concept that I think does not get nearly the amount of attention that it deserves. I like to point out the work of the Blockchain and Transport Alliance in this regard. They have really, from a very early stage in BITA, recognized that creating data standards and normalizing data standards was going to be critical to the success of any blockchain solution. For those who may not be familiar with the Blockchain and Transport Alliance, they are actually one of the largest blockchain consortia groups in the US and also in the foreign markets, mostly based in the US. I have a lot of brand name shipping and logistics providers involved in BITA, and they have been quietly working for the last several years on a massive initiative actually, to get all the various members to agree on data standards with the idea that that is the first step toward building a lasting and effective blockchain solution in the shipping and logistics industry. And so I encourage folks to think about this question long and hard as one of the initial steps as to whether blockchain makes sense. Because even if blockchain makes sense, if you can't effectively standardize and normalize the data that would go into that solution, then you're not going to really get too far. An example I like to bring up in that regard is a property registry pilot that took place in my hometown of Cook County, Illinois. I live in Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago. And Cook County in 2016 did a really interesting pilot where they experimented with the ability to put Cook County property register records on a blockchain. And they published a pretty detailed report coming out of that. And the report had a lot of good findings, but 2 that were particularly interesting was that it found, number 1, that blockchain actually would be a very effective way to manage property registries. But secondly, it found that the complications in standardizing and normalizing data were going to be a major impediment to implementing a blockchain solution. And in fact, a lot of folks that were involved in that project and that have looked at it have said that it's that failure to come up with a method to standardize and normalize data to actually put the property registries on the blockchain is what really kind of has been a roadblock to that pilot continuing to develop since 2016 when they went through all that. So just one example of how data normalization and standards is of critical importance when you're thinking about blockchain for enterprise applications. So if you find that blockchain makes sense, and if you find that you can standardize and normalize the data in a way that's effective, what's next? And again, this is a concept that I think does not get as much attention as it deserves. My recommended next step is to understand and put the time into understanding the current state of what it is that you're trying to, the problem that you're trying to solve with blockchain. What is the current state of that system, of those processes? And here I like to point to actually one of the very first blockchain enterprise pilots, which was done by the US Department of the Treasury. And they implemented a blockchain pilot to try to track and manage government-owned laptops and cell phones that were being used by Treasury employees. And I love this quote. What they found is that in their case, nearly half of our project was devoted to understanding and documenting our processes and uncovering surprising friction points. And they say, you may also uncover, as we did, that what you thought you were doing isn't what's being done. And so, the message there is that in any complex system, especially supply chains that we're going to talk about today, oftentimes the way you think things are being done are not how they're actually being done. And so it's critical to understand how things are actually being done before you can design an effective solution as to the future state of how they could be done when you bring blockchain into the mix. So understanding the current state is critical. All right, so let's dive into that a little bit. And now I'm going to go through 3 different examples of what I call a current state, future state analysis. And I'm going to use examples from 3 different industries, 3 industries where I think blockchain has been used and has a lot of potential to continue to be used in enterprise applications. And that's the food supply chain, the cobalt supply chain, and the pharma supply chain. So we'll start with the food supply chain. So here's a look at a very simple look at the current state of the food supply chain ecosystem. So, where does food start? It starts with the producer. From the producer, it goes on a truck. That truck then takes it to a business, that an entity that aggregates and brings together produce from a lot of different producers, warehouser. It then gets onto another truck. And from that truck, it goes to a manufacturer and a processor. And now the food gets processed. From there, it goes on to yet another truck. And then from there, the products oftentimes go to a port authority. Then they get on a ship inside one of those large shipping containers. Then they move to yet another port authority somewhere else in the world in a different jurisdiction. From there, they get on yet another truck. From there, the products are now dropped off at a distributor. From there, there's actually another truck, but that truck didn't really fit very well into the slide here. So we just have an arrow here. And from there, they're transported to finally a grocer, seller of the product, and finally to the endpoint consumer. But that's not all. There's more to this ecosystem, and those are the entities that are overseeing and have an interest in this whole process. So some of those are banks, for example. Banks that are maybe extending loans and services to the producers, to the manufacturers, to the warehousers, state departments of agriculture, federal departments of agriculture, the USDA, federal customs and border protection agencies, both in the US and in foreign markets. Other entities like the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States that impose regulations governing these processes. And then finally, insurers that do things like insure the grocers, insure the distributors against things like spoilage, transportation damage, and other losses. And so, I want to highlight here that you've got sort of the primary group of folks on that supply chain. You've got the transportation that is supporting that supply chain. And then you've got the entities, government and private sector entities that are overseeing it and have an interest in that supply chain. And so that's a general way to sort of look at here in the food supply chain, but really any supply chain scenario. Once you've got that mapped out, the next step is just ask yourself and think about what is the current state of the relationships between the entities in this ecosystem. And in the food supply chain and many others, what you'll probably end up finding is that you've got a lot of binary relationships where information really just isn't being shared and managed as effectively and efficiently as possible. And you've got a lot of different parties that are looking at this supply chain from a lot of different angles, all from their own vantage point. So, for example, the producers, the warehousers, and the manufacturers are interested in things like lawful processing and transport. They're interested in things like accuracy of product code labeling and the representations and certifications on those food products. The regulators and even the banks that have an interest in making sure their banking partners are behaving well are interested in things like use of approved materials and products. They're interested in things like fair labor standards and fair trade and sourcing requirements. Over on the end of the customs authorities and the distributors and the grocers, they're more interested in things like making sure that the expiration dates and certain labels and handling of the products is being done in the right way. And then the regulatory agencies are interested in things like with food products, proper temperatures and conditions and the lack of tampering in those products. And then, of course, what you often find, and this is why I think blockchain is so compelling in these circumstances, is that the individual at the end of the supply chain often has very little visibility into any of this, even though they're the one arguably with the highest level of interest, because they're the one actually paying for and consuming that product. And so identifying sort of the current status of the relationships between these parties and identifying the different unique vantage points and the different types of data and information that they are interested in is a critical step toward understanding the current state of the solution that you are looking to solve, that you're looking to implement. Once you understand this current state, you can start to envision the future state. And here's a real simple example of that. What if all of these different things that we saw on the previous slide were all available in real time to every party who all using the same shared blockchain data set? And it's not hard to imagine some of the great efficiencies that can come out of that. And here I want to take the opportunity to sort of establish and highlight this concept of what I call a micro consortium, and that is it's a good way to think about the first step towards standing up a blockchain enterprise solution that will be hosted in a consortium of business entities. And a micro consortium is where you have, at least the way I define it, is where you have one entity from every key step along the supply chain for whatever product it is that you are dealing with. So one producer, one warehouser, one manufacturer and processor, one or probably two customs authorities, one distributor, and then one grocer. And once you can get one from all of those key pieces of the supply chain on board, then you have what I like to call a micro consortium. And I often advocate that the best way to start looking at these things when you're standing up a consortium is to put together a micro consortium where you only have one from each step along the chain. And that's a great way to pilot a solution because you have everyone you need in that supply chain to actually implement and monitor a pilot. And it's from there that you can then expand, vertically in this instance to bring on more producers, more warehousers, more manufacturers, and so on and so forth. The idea is that by bringing everyone onto the shared data set, those different parties along that supply chain will be able to share data and see things and drive efficiencies from that data in ways that they are not currently able to do in the current state. And that is the whole, obviously that is the promise of blockchain in the enterprise context. But what happens to your business and legal relationships when you implement a blockchain solution? And this is, in my opinion, critical to understand so that you can account for a lot of these things as you are standing up and developing a pilot and moving toward a live environment. So the biggest one, the one that I want to really hit home today, is the data analytics and monetization. As you implement a blockchain solution, whether it's in the food supply chain, cobalt, pharma, or otherwise, these key members of the consortium, these key members along the supply chain that will be entering data into and using data from that blockchain data set, as that blockchain data set grows, the ability to run analytics on that data set and eventually use those analytics to glean useful and valuable information is going to be critical. And especially ultimately, you will be able to eventually monetize that valuable information. And that is, in a lot of respects, the revenue promise of blockchain solutions. And I encourage folks to be aware of this issue from a very early stage, because putting in the proper boundaries around who has the rights and permissions to access, to analyze, and eventually to monetize that data set is going to be critical. Next, how do you incorporate the blockchain that's being used up here in the middle with blockchains that are being used down here? So again, this could be the food trust up here, but down here, we're talking about the Blockchain and Transport Alliance. Over here, we're talking about maritime shipping blockchains like TradeLens or like the Global Business Shipping Network. And so, from a very early stage, I encourage folks to think about how are you going to integrate the data from your primary blockchain with data from other blockchains that may come along and become part of your solution. Other things to think about, you think about which types of data should be shared with the government agencies and other private companies that have an interest in this process. At some point, providing data access to this group at the top is going to be good for everybody. At a certain other point, providing too much access to that data can potentially have harmful effects on the blockchain industry consortia group. And then amongst the consortium members, how do you protect competitive data amongst potential competitors, both vertically and horizontally along that supply chain? These are all critical issues that are going to arise as blockchain is used to replace current data management systems. And then finally, of course, how do you protect the personal data rights of the ultimate end consumer? Because if no one feels comfortable using that solution, then it's simply not going to work. All right, let's look at some of these concepts now in the cobalt supply chain. Cobalt is probably a lesser known industry where blockchain is being piloted. The cobalt industry is booming these days. Cobalt is used primarily, the reason why is that cobalt is one of the primary materials used in generating lithium ion batteries, the same batteries that are used in things like laptop computers, cell phones, and more being used in electric vehicles. About 50% of the cobalt in the cobalt industry comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. For US products, a lot of that cobalt is then moved to South Korea, where it is manufactured into batteries, and then those batteries end up typically at manufacturing plants in the United States, where those batteries are incorporated into the end products. And so here, here's a sort of an overview of the cobalt supply chain. You've got the producers of the cobalt, some of which are larger companies, some of which are actually smaller, more locally owned businesses. They dig up that cobalt, they put it on a truck, that truck goes to a manufacturing and processing plant, a smelter, oftentimes in the same country, other times in a neighboring country. The cobalt then goes onto another truck, is almost always goes to a port where it's put on a ship, passes through another port authority on the other end, gets on yet another truck in another jurisdiction, another country, moves to a battery manufacturing plant, in this example in South Korea. Those batteries are then put on another truck, go through customs yet again, make their way to the United States, get on another truck and end up in a automobile manufacturing plant or a plant that is putting together laptop computers, cell phones, or other electronics. And then overseeing that whole process, you've got the 3 different countries involved, Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Korea, and the United States. And then you also have in the cobalt industry, other public sector agencies that have a high interest in cobalt, specifically because they're watching out for things like human rights violations. And the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development has been very involved in this. The United Nations and World Bank also looks at this stuff very closely. So those are other entities that have an interest. And each of these entities, again, has various perspectives. So, you know, from the perspective of the miners and the smelters and the transport and logistics agencies in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, they're interested in making sure they have data around who gets credit for those materials, data in terms of who has shipped and processed those materials effectively, and making sure that all that gets done correctly. Once the cobalt gets to South Korea and it is incorporated into batteries, you know, the battery manufacturer is interested more in things like compliance with contract terms and conditions and representations and warranties around the cobalt that ended up into those batteries and the folks who that cobalt was purchased from. And then, you know, when we look at the United States, you know, a lot of the manufacturers here in the US are interested more in things like improving upon material management and making sure that they are managing their inventory of those batteries most effectively and in a way that promotes consumer confidence, especially now that more and more consumers are becoming aware of the source of the materials that go into their products, and that's becoming more important to purchasing decisions. And then, of course, up here, you've got public sector agencies like the OECD that are monitoring labor practices, looking out for corruption, making sure that resources are being managed fairly. The different countries involved are interested in preventing fraud and counterfeiting and import-export. And then finally, you know, here in the US, there's more and more of an emphasis on responsible sourcing and industry practices for materials that end up in the products that we use. How can how can blockchain help some of this stuff in the cobalt industry? Well, the idea is that on the producers end, they can get more efficient and more effective and more accurate data around the different folks that they want to work with. So which producers are meeting their standards, which logistics agencies are doing a good job of pickups and deliveries, which smelters are doing a good job of getting that cobalt processed effectively. Customs, port, and logistics authorities, as well as the battery manufacturers, can get more real-time data that will help them to determine who is best complying with their contractual requirements for the purchase of that raw material. You know, on the end manufacturer side, key performance indicators of all these different members of the supply chain will help to drive decisions on who you want to work with in purchasing and obtaining the batteries, as well as the cobalt that goes into those batteries that end up into the final product. From the government and public sector perspective, if the OECD or the World Bank or the United Nations can get good key performance indicators on who is meeting ethical sourcing requirements, that could drive funding decisions. So that could help to drive decisions around, you know, potentially which folks in the Democratic Republic of the Congo qualify for certain aid programs. In terms of the relationships between the different countries involved, real-time import-export data can be very valuable. And then finally, from the US standpoint, you know, we are using a lot of cobalt. We're using more and more. And so transparency over the consumption of cobalt in the United States is another advantage that I think we can gain by moving some of this data set onto a blockchain, a shared blockchain ledger. And what are some of the new legal and business challenges that might arise? Again, I can't emphasize enough data analytics and data monetization amongst the parties the primary parties to a blockchain data set in that regard. Being able to appropriately integrate that data with other blockchains in the supply chain or in the logistics and transportation industry. In terms of preventing fraud and corruption, fraud programs and corruption and anti-corruption programs are going to have to be adopted so that they are more able to effectively use the new blockchain data set and the new forms that data is going to come in. And then, in terms of especially the end manufacturers, the battery manufacturers, drawing the right boundaries around when to share data and when that is beneficial for everyone, and when to protect and mask and make certain data confidential is going to be critical. And then there are all sorts of questions, especially in the cobalt industry, about how this new data will affect the relations between the different public sector entities and different governments that have an interest in the cobalt supply chain. So those are just some of the problems that can arise, I think, and issues that will need to be worked through as you implement blockchain in the cobalt supply chain. All right, let's look at one more. This is the pharmaceutical supply chain, arguably the most heavily regulated from a legal perspective of our three examples. So again, pharmaceuticals are, they start off in a manufacturing plant, move to a truck, eventually move to a packager, get on another truck, often go through customs, overseas, back through customs, on another truck, back to a distributor or the warehouse, eventually onto another truck, end up in a pharmacy where they're purchased by the consumer. That consumer takes it home. They often actually sit in the medicine cabinet of the consumer. By that time, each container has a label, looks something like this. And that label then corresponds to the actual product. And so that is a very simplified form of the pharmaceutical supply chain in its current state. Overseeing that process are the biggest issue is counterfeiting and recalls. We have major problems with counterfeit drugs entering the pharma supply chain here in the United States. It's something that the FDA is very seriously concerned about, and it should be a concern for all of us. U.S. Customs and Border Protection has a role to play in helping to prevent counterfeit drugs from entering the U.S. supply chain, because a lot of them enter from the foreign markets. These are just three of the major laws that govern the pharmaceutical supply chain. This is the Compounding Quality Act, which applies to the way that drugs are put together and managed once they hit the pharmacies. I'm sure everyone has heard of HIPAA. That is the very complex law in the United States that governs patient rights and data around healthcare data for patients. And then the Drug Supply Chain Security Act is a very important one. It's an act that was enacted in 2019. Enacted in 2013, went into effect beginning in 2019. It's going to go into effect over the course of 10 years. It will be phased in. By 2023, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act calls for an electronic system for tracking and managing pharmaceuticals along the entire supply chain in the United States, with the goal, with several goals, but one of the main goals is to help prevent counterfeit drugs from entering the U.S. Pharmaceutical supply chain. And so by 2023, pharmaceutical providers and all the folks in this supply chain here are going to have requirements related to this new electronic data system that is supposed to be implemented. It may get kicked down past 2023, but it is going to be required eventually. And so the pharma industry is going to have to figure out how to comply with this thing. And a lot of folks think that blockchain is the solution. So let's look at some of the problems in the current state. So with pharmaceuticals, chain of custody on transport and chain of custody on the processing of pharmaceuticals is critical to ensuring that counterfeit products are not in the supply chain, and to the extent that they are, or to the extent that there is a recall, helping to identify that quickly and eliminate those products. Managing contract terms and representations and warranties around things like expiration dates and proper labels and handling of those products is critical for the distributors. Customs have an interest in that, and then of course the pharmacies are the last people to touch those products before they get sold to the end consumer. And then, protecting consumer health and safety, and then also consumer data privacy rights is critical, especially as you're implementing new systems, new electronic systems that can be used to help track and manage products. What are some of the things that the regulators and the laws are interested in? Well, communication and information sharing around things like recalls, collaboration to help prevent counterfeit drugs from even entering the United States in the first place. And then compliance with all these 3 laws up here related to pharmacies, related to patient data protections, and related to the new data tracking requirements that will be implemented by the DSC SA are all some of the pain points in the current state of the pharma supply chain. How can blockchain help? I think, this is a great use case for blockchain. So, a real-time data set, tracking and managing data along the pharma supply chain can help you to reduce spoilage, increase efficiencies in terms of transport, increase efficiencies related to dispensing those products, getting them from the distributor to the pharmacies so that they're there when people need them, getting people to actually participate in the system. So, for example, if a consumer finds that they have bought a product that later ends up being subject to a recall, the consumer may one day with a blockchain solution be able to, for example, scan a QR code on the back of that label and help to be a part of the solution in terms of identifying where the products from that recall are, and to verify that indeed that they are out of harm's way in terms of affecting real people. How can blockchain help? In terms of the different authorities that are overseeing this process? Well, enhanced coordination and quicker response time over recalls, preventing counterfeiting, and eventually helping improve accountability in terms of where those counterfeit drugs are coming from. That's a critical one for that U.S. Customs could potentially get out of a blockchain solution in the pharma industry. And then finally, the real trick and what myself and a lot of folks on my team have been working on and helping folks with is, improving the quality of data while at the same time protecting data privacy for consumers. And that's not just under HIPAA, but it's also under things like the GDPR and the CCPA, which I'll talk more about in just a little bit. So what are some of the new legal and business relationships that we're going to see as blockchain solutions are implemented in the supply chain? Again, I can't say it enough. The issues around who gets to access, view, analyze, and then eventually monetize that new data from that new data set is a critical business problem and a big opportunity for everybody involved. How do you manage and share that data in the event that there's a dispute or an investigation is going to be critical, especially in the pharma context, where there is a lot at stake when there are counterfeit drugs identified or when there is a recall that is initiated. Because when that happens, all of these parties, they're all pointing the finger at each other from a legal perspective. And so making sure that each party has access to the data they need, and making sure that each party has the ability to sort of uphold and defend their own rights in that data, especially in the event that there is a dispute over who is responsible or liable for things like a recall or counterfeit drugs entering the chain, is going to be a critical business problem that has to be solved. And again, the opportunity is that it's going to help us to better handle those events, where counterfeit drugs enter the chain. Being able to demonstrate the benefits of a blockchain data set while also being able to demonstrate that you are complying with privacy rights is going to be a critical business problem. And then finally, and probably maybe most importantly in the pharma example, is what level of data access do you give to the FDA, to Customs and Border Protection, and to all the regulators that are enforcing these different laws that govern this supply chain. And again, being able to provide certain data in real time, especially, can really go a long way toward helping the government do its job and to actually insulating some of the industry participants from liability. But giving too much data could potentially be harmful, especially in the context that there may be disputes over who is responsible when things maybe go wrong. So those are just some examples of the legal and business issues that I expect to see as blockchain solutions make their way into the pharmaceutical supply chain market. So those are my three examples that I encourage folks to think about in terms of putting together a current state, future state analysis and identifying the new issues that will arise as the future state is implemented. On this slide, I just want to highlight a couple of the other key contractual relationships that I expect to be triggered as blockchain enterprise solutions are stood up and implemented. One that folks are not going to be really used to thinking about is the costs and effort involved in hosting a private permission blockchain, maybe something like on Hyperledger Fabric. So things like standardizing cloud service agreements for the different nodes supporting that blockchain, things like coming up with standards for technical and organizational measures, cybersecurity, methodologies for making sure that the peers that are each hosting that blockchain are testing each other's nodes to make sure that they all comply with the standards that were chosen. How to easily add and remove nodes as different participants join that consortia or leave that consortia. How to push technical updates most efficiently. How to respond to incidents. And here I want to point out, especially with regard to pushing technical updates, this is TruffleCon. And so I want to point out that this is an area where I think the Truffle suite of tools can be especially helpful. Using Truffle tools can really help you to push and implement technical updates a lot more efficiently than without those tools. So that's just one of many areas where I think Truffle could be involved in blockchain enterprise consortia projects. Establishing different membership tiers and rights and responsibilities for those members is also going to be critical. And then again, who has access to the data in terms of read access, in terms of write access, in terms of the ability to analyze it, the ability to turn it into valuable information, and then eventually the ability to monetize that valuable information. Defining that stuff is going to be critical. And then making sure that everyone's interests are aligned in data standards and integrity, especially in terms of normalizing that data, especially in terms of using that data in the event of technical failures or fraud, corruption, and things like that. So those are some of the other new contractual relationships that folks need to think about. Once you have your current and future state analysis, once you've gained an understanding of how the future state is going to change your relationships, another thing to really think about closely and analyze closely before you get too heavy into the tech development is to understand which blockchain protocol you're going to use and what the implications are of that. And sometimes the business needs will drive the selection of the protocol. Other times, the needs or desires of the consortium members will drive the selection of the protocol, and you may have to sort of retrofit a little bit in terms of how that protocol is used most effectively. A simple way that I like to look at this is to compare Hyperledger with Ethereum. These are two of the protocols that are most used for pilots in the enterprise sector here in the United States. Just as a couple rough points of comparison, with Hyperledger, it's a private blockchain. So you've got certain additional costs related to standing up the private nodes that will host that blockchain. The validation process is arguably more efficient and faster. Hyperledger typically uses a follow the leader protocol where transaction blocks can be validated more quickly, but you have to have more trust in that leader node that everyone else is following. And so there's a little bit of a give and take there. Hyperledger, as a private permission blockchain, there are less concerns around what data can be written to that blockchain. On the Ethereum side, it's obviously a public blockchain, so you want to be very careful about what type of data you're going to write to the Ethereum blockchain. What a lot of folks have been thinking about and doing in pilots is not writing the actual data, but writing hashes of batch data to Ethereum, so that you may not be getting real-time data on the Ethereum blockchain, but you are getting periodic hashes that will help you to validate that the data that is being stored off the blockchain is accurate. And And then, of course, with Ethereum, there are less costs to running nodes because Ethereum is public, and so there are miners out there running those nodes for you. There are, of course, gas costs to consider. And one thing that's not on this slide that I think I want to mention here is that there are emerging solutions, in particular one from Ernst & Young that is working to solve problems around how to share data on the public Ethereum blockchain in a way that protects the privacy of that data. So maybe that solutions like that can sort of help to bridge the gap between some of the differences between something like Hyperledger, a private permission blockchain, and something like Ethereum, a public permissionless blockchain. There's also, it's not really just one or the other. I like to point out this newly launched pilot by Bitfury, the Exonum blockchain, where they're using a sort of framework that I think could be adapted to other enterprise applications where you have a private permission blockchain that is being used by consortium members who write data to that private blockchain. And then periodically, certain data from that private blockchain is hashed and batched and written to a public blockchain like the Bitcoin blockchain or like the Ethereum blockchain. And so now you have a solution where you've got the private consortium members that maybe have access to real-time data and that they're all sharing on the private permission blockchain. That data is walled off from the general public, but the general public, including potentially government agencies overseeing some of those processes, will have access to periodically batched data that can later be verified against the data in the private blockchain if needed, in the event of something like a recall, in the event of something like an investigation of products along a supply chain. And so I think we're going to see more and more that private blockchains and public blockchains are not going to be used, where it's just one or the other, but rather where solutions will emerge that are utilizing both public and private blockchains at the same time in the same enterprise context. All right, I am running a little short on time. This slide I am going to skip over. There's a lot of detailed information here about different consensus mechanisms and the advantages and disadvantages. If you're interested in learning more about that, I encourage you to provide your email address and I will send you this slide deck and you can dig deeper into that. But the point is there are a lot of options here. I want to note that Truffle tools can be very helpful along this process in several different contexts. So Truffle now, it's primarily focused on Ethereum, but Truffle now, some of the tools are usable on Tezos, the Corda blockchain, Hyperledger Fabric, and Quorum. And so I encourage folks to, no matter what blockchain you've selected, look to see where Truffle can help you. Here are the actual definitions behind those 4 icons. So it's Truffle, Ganache, Drizzle, and Truffle Teams are the 4 main products that I encourage people to learn more about and how they can help you with standing up blockchain enterprise solutions. And now let's start to zoom out. So here's the roadmap for enterprise development. We've actually also already gone through these first 3 steps. And with a lot of these steps, I like to assign them to the technical folks, the business folks, or the legal folks. So these first 3 steps, the feasibility analysis is really the technical folks will be leading this. Does blockchain make sense? Can the data be normalized? Do you understand the current state? Can you envision the future state? What are the new legal, business, and contractual issues? That's where the business and legal folks will start to get involved. Putting together a micro consortium like I talked about. Selecting your protocol. This is very much the job of the tech folks. With input from business and potentially legal. From there, where do you go from there? So from there, step 4, initiate a test net. Step 5, work with the business folks to come up with a little bit of a term sheet, a non-binding memorandum of understanding that governs the relationship between the parties to that blockchain solution. And then eventually the legal folks would get involved in step 6, forming a legal entity around that solution and managing things like IP rights, data rights, and funding. Steps 7, 8, and 9 can all be done sort of at the same time. Step 7 is primarily the business folks dealing with corporate governance, appointing a board of directors, a mission statement, bringing on advisors. The data takes, I think, precedence first in terms of the technical folks coming up with technical and organizational measures for that data and for the nodes to the extent you're using a private blockchain. For the business folks dealing with things like the GDPR and the CCPA and different rights to that data. And then finally, steps 10, 11, and 12, cybersecurity standards. That's the job of the technical folks. Dealing with some of the other legal and regulatory issues, like defining things like what happens in the event of disputes, who gets indemnity for what, how is liability spread out. Executing an IP strategy. Are there any patentable inventions? Thinking about things like antitrust, thinking about things like token models. I'll mention those in just a second. And then finally, the live pilot. This is where the business folks are most involved. And so a lot of these steps can be taken some of them simultaneously, but these are sort of the 12 main steps that I like to use to break out the full life cycle of getting from concept to deployment in the enterprise context. Last things I want to leave you all with are some of the big picture legal issues, things that you ought to be aware of sooner rather than later to make sure that they don't disrupt or the development of solutions. The GDPR and the CCPA are very tricky new laws that are going to become very important to the extent that any solution involves personal data. I'll caution that personal data is defined very broadly under both laws. And under both laws, data subjects have a right of erasure or deletion. And so for that reason, it is very important to understand what is and isn't personal data and to make sure that personal data is not stored on a blockchain, an immutable data set, because that will be very problematic. And while these issues are complicated, I've been through them now in a couple different contexts, and they can be managed. And one of the high-level pieces of advice I'd like to give is to folks managing these issues is to understand that every blockchain solution really, the data is not stored just on a blockchain. It's really stored in 3 different places: personal devices, the blockchain itself, and offline databases. And so managing that data and which data goes and flows through which of these is one of the keys to compliance with these new data protection laws. Smart contracts, this is another area where Truffle tools can help. You need to be able to identify which of your smart contracts will actually have status as legal contracts or which will have legal contractual issues that govern them. And for example, what happens when smart contracts don't function the way that they should. Again, that's an area where Truffle tools can help you to avoid those problems, but you also want to have legal agreements that help you to manage some of that risk. Antitrust issues are going to become more and more important. This year with the DOJ, we've seen a new focus on technology companies here in the US. There's already been a heavy focus on antitrust issues in technology in Europe. And so I encourage folks to keep these in mind as you're bringing together different folks from industry, especially people who are competitors in the same industry, and to make sure that you are abiding by the guidelines for collaborations amongst competitors that the Federal Trade Commission has published. And then finally, token models. I'm just going to spend a minute on this. I could do a whole presentation on this, but the high level guidance and advice that I want to give to everyone is that these things get really, really tricky to the extent that you're going to utilize anything like an ERC20 token or other types of cryptocurrencies in your blockchain enterprise solutions. Please recognize that you need advice from legal counsel on these. We have 4 different agencies in the US that all define cryptocurrencies in 4 different ways. It gets very complicated very quickly. And so I beg you really to make sure that you are engaging with competent legal counsel to the extent that you ever looking to implement cryptocurrencies, ERC20 tokens, or other token type products and digital assets into your blockchain solutions. And that is about it. I believe I'm at my time. Again, I'm Robert Musiala. Here's my contact information. Please feel free to get in touch with any questions. Sorry we didn't have time for questions today. I'll leave it to Scott in case we do have time. I'm happy to hang out if we have time. Otherwise, feel free to send me an email. I encourage you to check out my weekly blog, The Blockchain Monitor. We post it every Friday. If you want to know what I'm paying attention to, it's all in that weekly blog. And that's all I've got. That's all the time I've got. Thank you all for tuning in and listening today. And enjoy the rest of your day at TruffleCon.